So many more people are starting to talk about mental health and well-being, so now is a good time to address the language that we use. Welcome back to my channel. If this is the first time that you've ever been here, on this channel I talk about mental health and well-being. I challenge our perception, the ways that we view mental health in general. I unpack some of my feelings and my emotions and how I struggle in the world and how I still try to succeed in the world in spite of some of them struggles. So if that feels like it might be a benefit for you, then I'd really like for you to stick around and make sure that you have subscribed and turned on the notifications so you know each and every time I post a video. So I do have a firm belief that language is very, very important when it comes to the mental health and well-being and the way in which we talk about it. And like I've said, with so many more people entering into the conversation, I think now's a good time to start challenging the language that we use, to ask if it can become more inclusive and help to create a cultural shift that's needed in the ways in which we perceive mental health and well-being. So today I'm looking at 5 things that I think are really good starting points and really good topics of conversation to get us to think about ways in which we might change. So number 1 is the way in which we talk about stigma. Now, when it comes to stigma, we have a belief that the people that are driving stigma are simply naive, uneducated, and actually most of us perceive them as just simply being nasty. I think if we go beyond that, that's not actually the case. I think most people that create stigma and have a real adverse reaction to anybody that is talking about mental health and well-being are normally people that are struggling and coping in a certain way. And when we talk about mental health, we push them to a place where they don't want to be, and so they get defensive and they create stigma around mental health. And if that is true to be the case, then the language that we use when we talk about fighting stigma and smashing stigma and breaking stigma is all very conflicting. So it's all about kind of fighting back against the stigma, when actually, if what I've just said is to be true, then what we need is empathy and compassion. And in that ways, then we need to start talking more about maybe ending the stigma. And I don't even know necessarily the better language to use, but I just think the way in which we talk about a fight and creating conflict is not what it's about when it comes to mental health and well-being. I also believe that connection is so important when we're talking about and looking at any kind of healing. And so talking about fighting or smashing or breaking the stigma can actually be problematic. And if we start talking more about ending stigma and coming together to make the conversation more inclusive so that we can end the stigma, then I think that's actually going to be much more of a productive conversation than using conflicting terms or terms of conflict. So number 2 is the way in which we talk about emotions. So whenever we are feeling any kind of emotion, we have a tendency to say, I am that emotion. I am sad. I am scared. I am anxious. And the language in itself gives the impression that whatever feeling or whatever emotion we are experiencing in the moment, that we become that emotion. And that shouldn't be the case, and is not the case. So I do think that the subtle shift from saying I am sad to I'm feeling sad is hugely important, and particularly when we're looking at young people and the perceptions in which we give them in the language that we use, I think it's really hugely important to start to change that so that we recognize that if you're feeling anxious, then that's what you're feeling. It doesn't mean that you are anxious. Subtle change in the language, big change in the perception. Number 3 is all about the way in which we listen. So I've always said, anybody that follows my stuff will know that I say, we don't have a talking problem, we have a listening problem. And when it comes to asking the right questions, when somebody has come to us and being able to open up, some of the things that we think are questions are actually statements. So I'm talking that the very obvious one is, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you is not a question. What's wrong with you is normally something it's a statement that's made in a reaction to something that's been triggered in the person that's asking the question. So they're not actually seeking to see what that person is struggling with. They're actually making a statement that I think there's something wrong with you. So it's quite a judgment. Another one is, you're okay, aren't you? That's not a question. That is letting somebody know that you need them to be okay, and you're seeking for them to validate that need rather than asking, how are you feeling? And if we look at the question of what's wrong with you, if we start to say, what happened to you? How are you feeling? These questions are much more open and much more free from judgment. Number 4 is the way that we separate mental health and physical health. I actually think we're probably a little bit away from this at the moment, but I actually think that we do need to start to reach a place where we just simply talk about health. Anxiety is the perfect example to use for this. We often only ever talk about the mental side of anxiety because it's seen as a mental health problem. We talk about the kind of fear, the worry, the concern, the impending doom, all of the ways in which anxiety manifests itself within our mind. But actually, anxiety is a very physical thing as well. You know, the sweaty palms, the fluttering heart, the tight chest, the feeling like your whole body's shaking but nobody can actually see that you're shaking, feeling like everyone can see inside of your mind, right? The last one of them is mental as well, right? But this is what I'm on about. When we use the language, it's very difficult to actually separate them, and our bodies and our minds don't do that when we're struggling. So, you know, when I'm feeling very sad, it's a very physical feeling, and every emotion, actually, when we describe them, we often describe the physical feeling of them first. So to separate them, it actually goes against what's really going on. Number 5, and probably the hardest to get your head around, is I believe we need to start reaching a place where we look at our mental health struggles, our mental ill health, as a reaction to something. I do believe, and I'm not a scientist or a doctor, so I can't give you any proof, but from the work that I do and the more and more I experience and interact with people, and the more and more I compassionately listen to people, the more I start to realize that so much of what we struggle with starts as an unmet need. And often it's an unmet need that is followed by an unhealthy coping mechanism that sends us into a spiral, creating the mental health struggle that we have. And so I do think in years to come, we will look back at the way that we talk about mental health as just kind of this thing that happens to us or certain people. I think we'll look back and think that, you know, we were quite far behind on that. I do think that we should start looking at our mental health struggles as responses to something, and really start to compassionately inquire why they are there. For me, my depression started off as a coping mechanism. The emotions and feelings that I was succumbed to were too powerful, were too strong and too overwhelming, so I depressed them. And then that started to manifest itself in depression symptoms. And I think that's true to a lot of things. Anxiety for me started as a coping mechanism. It started as a way of protecting me, keeping me alert from the things that were happening. It served a purpose at the time, but as I move forward in my life, it starts to have a detrimental effect. And so when we start to recognize these things, then I think we can start to have much more of an ability to manage some of the struggles that we have. So there you have it. There's 5 ways there. There's loads more that I could do, and I probably will do in the future. Now, don't make myself right on all of them. What the point is of the video is to start to challenge ourselves, to start to challenge, can we change things? Can we change our language? Can we help to become part of that cultural shift that's needed in the way that we perceive mental health and well-being? They're conversation starters. I'd love to hear your opinions on them. You might make some of them wrong. You might think the language that we're currently using is better than some of the ways that I suggested. You might think they're right. I'd love to hear from you. As always, if you think this video has been useful in any way, then make sure that you've liked it. And I will see you again next week.